Okay, so we are moving along, and part two of Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine. Book two is divided into two separate parts. Book two is called The Knowledge and the Ignorance, the Spiritual Evolution, and then it in turn has a second part, book two, part two, Knowledge and the Spiritual Evolution. Almost the same title, except that he's gotten rid of the avidya idea, the ignorance idea. Um, Okay, so part one is subtitled "The Infinite Consciousness and the Ignorance," and then so chapter one of this part is Indeterminates, Cosmic Determinations, and the Indeterminable. This is a very long and difficult chapter to follow. You really have to sort of concentrate on it, because what he means by the indeterminates are the absolutes. Of course, Brahman is an indeterminate. The boundless finite, infinite extension, infinite non-being. These are indeterminables, or indeterminates, whichever. And so the question is, how do determinations, which are basically qualities and properties that things possess on the physical plane, how do determinations come out of the indeterminate, number one? And number two, how do they come out of unified determinants? So we have, let's say, how does a unity determinant like electricity have determinations like waves and particles? How does an energy substance as a determinant manifest itself in a bunch of different gases, or indeed even in the periodic table of elements? How do we get all these determinations from a single unified determinant? How do we get a tree out of an acorn as a determinant, with the tree itself as a determination of the acorn? How do we get from this basic animal substance all these different species, all these determinations of all these different species? So that becomes the question, is the relation of determinations to unified determinants, and then all of that to the indeterminables. So that's the question that he wants to ask, and he says, and so the point of it is that the difficult part of it is, he says, we do not find anything in any general or generic determinate necessitating the variant determinations that result from it. A necessity of immutable sameness at the base, that's the unity determinant, at the base of free and unaccountable variations on the surface seems to be the law, but who or what necessitates or determines? So there are two possible explanations, he says at first. One of them is chance. That these determinations, all the different species of animals, all the different types of atoms in the periodic table of the elements, all the different colors in the visible spectrum, this is all just chance, which is totally ridiculous for obvious reasons. Just sweep that out the door. The other explanation is mechanical law, which is much closer to the truth. Certainly, the mechanical law of causality does prevail, certainly over the physical world, but it still doesn't explain why you get so much variety, so many determinations from a fundamental substantial unity. It doesn't cover it, and it certainly doesn't apply to living things either. And so neither explanation is satisfactory to him as far as it goes. And so we know what his answer is going to be. It's consciousness. Consciousness with a capital C, the universal macro consciousness that moves through all things. This is the thing that through the play of Leela, the dance of the world through Maya and Leela and space and time, is playing, putting on all these costumes, taking them off again, and giving us this peacock's tail display of this efflorescence of determinants and their determinations. And then so now he's moving, the whole section of this middle section of the book will be primarily concerned with the mind and moving inward. And so what he wants to know is then, so as we look at this panoply of all of these, what are called chitta vrittis. Chitta is consciousness in the Indian tradition. Chitta vrittis, which take on the form of all of this play of phenomena that faces us from the realm of prakriti, the realm of matter in the Sankhya tradition. And then within us, of course, we have the Purusha. It might be worth glancing at a simple version of the model of Sankhya, just a very simple, quick sketch of it, where Sankhya philosophy creation model, at the core there we have the Purusha, and it is surrounded then by Prakriti, which is the realm of nature, which is characterized by three gunas: Tamas guna, which is inertia; Rajas guna, which is fiery, passionate activity; and Sattva guna, which is clarity. And also, it might be worth glancing to it. What he's trying to synthesize is the traditional Vedantic model of Brahman and Atman. So this is a very simple, sketchy idea of the Vedantic model, where we have that middle dotted line there is the realm of Maya, which divides the manifest realm, Vyakta, to the left, versus the unmanifest, Avyakta. And the manifest realm is made of names and forms, Nama Rupa, up in the top blue bubble there. And down below we have the five elements in the pink rectangle on the right-hand side. Those are the Vedantic sheaths, the five koshas that we've already been over. And then sometimes Vedanta uses the jiva, but the jiva it's equivalent to a Purusha, but it really comes from Jainism. And then here we have Brahman and Atman, and in the middle is the realization, thou art that. That is the ultimate realization through the path of jnana yoga, the knowledge yoga, the realization that the microsoul within you is the same as the macrosoul, the Brahman, the Satchidananda. They are one and the same. So it's monistic, in other words, whereas Sankhya is dualistic. And if we take a look at a more complex model of Sankhya, it might be worth glancing at that for a second. This is the evolution of Prakriti. So Purusha is not on this chart. But what happens here is that we have the Mula Prakriti, which is at the top, which then gives rise to universal intelligence, Mahat. And perhaps that's something analogous to Aurobindo's supramental, the Mahat. And then there's Chitta right below it. That's now individual consciousness, mental consciousness, Chitta, that's in constant motion as it takes on the forms of the outer world. And the individual intelligence is the Buddhi, but that's the higher mind, the higher intelligence that's capable of intuition, not just intelligence. The lower intelligence to the left there is the Manas, the Manomaya Kosha in Vedanta. And it's tied in with the senses, and sometimes is regarded as the sixth sense. So the box on the lower left is the Gyanendriyas. The Indriyas are the senses. And so the Gyanendriyas, the knowledge, Jnana is knowledge. The Gyanendriyas are the organs of the body that correspond to the five senses: ears, skin, eyes, tongue, nose. But then we have five Karmendriyas, or active instrumental senses: mouth, arms, legs, the excretory and reproductive functions. And then over here we have then the five elements, the Mehabhutas. Above those, notice on the left we have Tanmatras, which are the subtle versions of these elements: sound, touch, form, taste, smell, which then code for their physical aspects as Mehabhutas: sound for space, touch for air, form for fire, taste for water, and smell for earth. And then so what sets all of this in motion is the presence of the Purusha within Prakriti that sets all of this in motion. This is the oldest purely philosophical system in India that is more or less atheistic. It's metaphysical, but it doesn't make any reference whatsoever to the gods. It's the first such system to do so. And so what Aurobindo wants to know then is that, so we run up to this dichotomy where we've got the Prakriti world of matter and the senses inflicting its panoply of phenomena on us, but then we have this Purusha within us, which then Aurobindo modifies a bit by saying that traditionally the Purusha in Sankhya is purely passive. It's not active, it doesn't do anything. It's just the soul monad that reincarnates from lifetime to lifetime. But because he has wed it with the concept of the personality, the subliminal personality, the psychic being, he believes that it actually does send out chitta vrittis as well from within. And so he says that the only way to get down to a knowledge of the universal consciousness that is within us, because as it enters within us, at first it's subliminal. The mental consciousness can perceive it, but only in a superficial way. We experience these emotions, impulses, passions, and sensations at a subconscious or subliminal level. So the only way to get down in there is through the practice of yoga, his version of yoga, which consists then in quieting the mind, calming it through breathing exercises and quieting it, because once that happens, a realization comes then that all of these sense impressions and thoughts, the chitta vrittis, are not in the mind. They're coming into the mind from without. So if they're coming into the mind from without, it may be from the physical world, it may be from the upper spiritual planes, but it's coming into the mind externally. Then you can sort of build a wall around your consciousness to prevent yourself from simply being pushed and pulled by these forces. We're always reacting to experiences through the senses that are acting upon us. With yoga, you get out of that loop. His version of yoga, anyway. You get out of that loop, and once you quiet those chitta vrittis, it's like throwing a stone in a pond. You have the ripples, and then the ripples settle. Then you can look down and see the stone, and that's the Purusha. So now you can look down within and see this, apparently at first in what's supposed to be traditional in Sankhya, a totally still, quiescent, luminous, maximum sattva guna is its characteristic Purusha, the thing that migrates from lifetime to lifetime. But it doesn't carry the personality with it, because India doesn't have a conception of the individual personality the way the West does. It just doesn't. But Aurobindo takes account of that, and then he says here in this, he specifically says, but then his version of the Purusha is not just a still, quiet thing. He says, this mental being, or Purusha, first appears as a silent witness in the tradition, and if that were all, we would have to accept the determinations of mind as a phenomenal activity imposed upon the being by nature, by Prakriti, or else as a creation presented to it by Prakriti, a world of thought which nature constructs and offers to the observing Purusha. But, and now here's his reformation of the tradition, but afterwards we find that the Purusha, the mental being, can depart from its posture of a silent or accepting witness. It can become the source of reactions, accept, reject, even rule and regulate, become the giver of the command, the knower. And so comes this sort of dichotomy, which is how to resolve this. And so on the next page, on the 326, he poses the question then as follows, that he's looking for the answer. It's an apparent dichotomy. The question then, in this case, is whether the building of thought, experience, world of perceptions of the mental person, the mind Purusha, is truly a self-expression, a self-determination, proceeding from some truth of his own spiritual being, a manifestation of that truth's dynamic possibilities, or whether it is not rather a creation or construction presented to him by nature, by Prakriti, and only in the sense of being individualized in his personal formation of that nature can it be said to be his own or dependent on him. And then, I guess just for fun, he throws in a third, or again, it might be a play of cosmic imagination, a fantasia of the infinite, in other words, kind of a Maya trick, but I don't think he takes that third point seriously. It's really these 2 points. Whether the Purusha has this self-expression with determinations of its own, and maybe then it isn't truly indeterminate, or whether all of this is coming from the outer world, from Prakriti. And so now to solve this, we could have reference to the overmind, which we defined last time, but the problem with the overmind is that it's of no help, because the overmind, remember, recognizes the equal validity of each perspective. It doesn't prioritize any validity or any perspective. And so he says, in overmind, all the higher ranges of the mind, we find recurring the dichotomy of a pure silent self without feature or qualities or relations, self-existent, self-poised, self-sufficient, and the mighty dynamis of a determinative knowledge power, or a creative consciousness and force which precipitates itself into the forms of the universe. And so overmind just really doesn't help solve the problem, because it recognizes the validity of everything. So then he brings in the Vedantic tradition of Brahman, the ultimate, and there are 2 aspects then to Brahman, Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman. The gunas, of course, are the qualities. So with Nirguna Brahman, that means Brahman without qualities. So it is the ultimate, it is the absolute, but it has no qualities. In this sense, it's just pure, I suppose, there-ness. It's silent. It's not void. He's always careful to reject the Buddhist idea of the void. Every time he mentions the void, he says, nah, sweep it away. He rejects Buddhism completely in that sense. It's not a void. It's a pulsing sort of energy, but it has no qualities, no determinations. But with Saguna Brahman with qualities, now it becomes the source of all kinds of determinations. It pours itself out through the panoply of the world. It becomes the basis of all different kinds of worlds. And so it is the root base of all the determinations of the world when looked at from that angle. So now, once again, the overmind is of no help here. So we have to resort to the supramental cognition, because the supramental is in between the absolute Brahman and the overmind, insofar as what the supramental will do is say, the supramental sees everything as a totality, as one single totality. It doesn't make divisions. So let's say we approach Brahman in terms of its qualities, and Brahman, the only determinations that it has are self-determinations. And in a certain sense, the supermind is the self-awareness of Brahman as a power, whereas Nirguna Brahman is Brahman as pure being. But with the supermind, it becomes Brahman as power. And so it is capable of having self-awareness and self-determinations in that sense. And so the supramental then, let's take Satchidananda then. Let's say, to look at it from the point of view of the overmind, Sat, Chit, Ananda would each be separate entities, or separate aspects, being conscious force and bliss. And the overmind would say, well, they're all equal faculties, but the mind, or let's say the supermind would say, no, they're all just one unified thing, Satchidananda. That's why there's one word for it that sometimes these Indian philosophers use, Satchidananda, which is the supramental cognition of it as a single unified whole, whereas the mind would privilege one of these. The mind would say, yeah, they're three separate things. So the overmind divides but does not privilege. The mind divides and privileges, and could lose itself in the Ananda experience at the expense of consciousness and existence. Or the other way around, it could lose itself in an experience of consciousness and lose the Ananda and lose the existence. So the mind is preferential. It's either or, and it's always exclusional, whereas the overmind is never exclusional, but divisive, whereas the supermind holds everything together into one single unity. And so it's the supermind, the supramental cognition, that solves this basic antinomy that the chapter introduces regarding the indeterminate on the one hand and the determinations of the indeterminate on the other. And so we come to the punchline of the chapter, which is really where he says on page 332, all this deploying of powers and possibilities, these are determinations, and their inherent consequences, is held together by supermind cognition in an intimate oneness. So that's the thing. And you can only become aware of this, as far as he's concerned, through the practice of yoga, which enables you to quiet the mind and be able to access these higher states of consciousness. Because the mind itself can't figure it out. The mind is a logic chopper. And philosophers who get stuck, who mistake philosophy for logic chopping, I feel sorry for those guys, to be quite honest. And that's what philosophy in the university system has been devolved and degraded into: logic chopping, qualia, Quine, and that school, Ayer, those pathetic individuals who miss the point of philosophy, that it has to do with understanding universals, understanding the big picture. But the mind can only get so far with that. As far as Aurobindo is concerned, it has to have recourse to other faculties and powers, the overmind, the intuitive mind, and so forth. And you can't access those with mind itself. You have to use the other powers accessed by yoga.